I planted mine in the last week of July, same as she taught me, kneeling in dirt that still smelled like the bean plants I'd just pulled out of it that morning. Little pale seeds, oval, no bigger than a pinhead, maybe 8 or 10 of them held loose in my palm. $2 for the packet. That's it. That's the whole investment. And from that one evening's work, my family ate greens off that bed by September, and roots off it clear through the winter, sitting cool and firm in a box in the corner of my cellar in February, when a bag of turnips at the grocery store would have run me $4 for barely enough to feed one person one supper. I want you to picture that bed the way I picture it every summer when I walk out there at dusk. The soil's still warm from the day. The bean vines are gone, pulled and composted. And I'm dropping seed into a furrow I scratched with the corner of my thumbnail, thinking about how my mother did this exact same thing in this exact same week every single year I was a girl, and how I kept doing it every year after I married Earl, and we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together most winters. That's what this video is. One crop, one planting, and a family fed from October straight through to the last frost of March. And I'm going to show you exactly how, step by step, so you can walk out to your own backyard this week and do the same thing. Here's what I want you to understand right off. This isn't fussy. It doesn't need a greenhouse, it doesn't need special equipment, and it won't hurt a thing in your yard. Not your soil, not whatever you planted before it, not your wallet. One packet of open pollinated turnip seed costs about $2 at any farm and garden store. And that $2, planted right, will feed you greens in the fall and roots all winter. And if you do the last step I'm going to teach you, you'll never have to buy that packet again for the rest of your life. I've been doing this so long, I don't even think about it anymore. And by the time we're done today, you won't have to think about it either. You'll just know it. My name is Linda. I've been keeping house for over 40 years now. And for a good long stretch of those years, my husband Earl and I raised our kids on one paycheck from a 60-room motel off a Florida highway. There wasn't money for extras, and there sure wasn't money for a winter's worth of vegetables trucked in from wherever the grocery store was buying that season. So I grew what I could, I stretched what I grew, and I learned to hold a harvest through the cold months without ever touching a refrigerator to do it. I raised 3 children on that kind of thrift, and I never once bought a bag of store turnips in February because I'd already grown my own back in July. Now here's my promise to you. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what to plant, exactly when to plant it, how to grow it right through the worst heat of summer, how to eat off it twice, once as greens and once as roots, and how to hold that harvest all winter without spending another dime on electricity or storage. And I'm going to tell you the part that ought to bother you a little, because it bothers me every time I think about it. This is not some new discovery. Women were doing this in their own backyards for generations before the grocery store ever got involved in the business of feeding you in January. It fell out of style, not because it quit working, but because there's more money in you pushing a cart down a produce aisle every single week for 6 months than there is in you growing a $2 packet of seed and feeding yourself for free. Nobody sat in a boardroom and outlawed the turnip patch. I don't believe that for a second. They just never went out of their way to remind you it was there. So stay with me. By the end of this, you'll have the whole thing, start to finish, and you'll understand exactly why nobody talks about it anymore. Here's what most folks get wrong before they even put a seed in the ground. They think growing a fall and winter vegetable means planting it in the fall. It doesn't. You plant this crop at the hottest, most miserable week of the summer, when the last thing on your mind is a root cellar. because it needs those long, cooling weeks of September and October to size up before the ground goes hard. If you wait until it feels like turnip weather to plant your turnips, you've already missed your window, and you'll be standing in your garden come November wondering why you've got nothing but a bed of skinny greens and no roots to speak of. That was my very first mistake too, years ago, so don't feel bad if it's yours. I planted my first patch in September because that's when it felt right in my head, and I got greens and not much else. My mother set me straight the next year. You plant in the heat, she told me, so you can eat in the cold. So let's get into it, step by step, the way I've done it every summer for more years than I can count. The first thing is what you plant and exactly when. The variety I use, the variety my mother used before me, is called Purple Top White Globe. It's an old variety. It's been sitting on American seed racks since the 1800s, and the important word on that packet is open pollinated. Sometimes it'll say OP, sometimes it'll say heirloom. What you do not want is a packet marked F1. That's a hybrid, and I'll explain later exactly why that matters. But for now, just remember to read the packet and skip anything marked F1. You want the last week of July or the first 2 weeks of August, and the way to figure your own exact window is to find your area's first hard frost date. Most extension offices and gardening almanacs will give you that, and count back about 10 weeks. That's your planting window, give or take. For the bed itself, you want ground that already gave you a spring crop, peas, early beans, spring lettuce, spent garlic, whatever came out of the ground by midsummer. Pull whatever's left of that old crop, rake the bed smooth, and work in a shovelful of good finished compost for every foot of row. I want to be clear here. Use compost that's fully broken down, not fresh manure, not this close to a harvest you're going to be eating raw or lightly cooked. That's just good sense in the kitchen later. Level that bed flat and you're ready. For the actual planting, there's 2 numbers I want you to remember because I've seen more turnip patches fail from getting these wrong than from anything else. Plant your seed 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch deep, no deeper. In that hot July dirt, if you bury the seed too deep, it just sits there in dry soil and never breaks the surface. Space your rows 12 to 18 inches apart, 12 if your garden's small and you're willing to thin hard later, 18 if you'd rather have room to walk the row and pull weeds by hand. Scratch a shallow little furrow with your finger or the corner of a hoe. Drop the seed then along it. Cover it with just a dusting of fine soil, about the depth of your fingernail, and press it down flat with the palm of your hand. That contact between the seed and moist soil is what wakes it up. Then water it in gently, not a flood, just enough to soak that top inch of soil, and do it in the evening, not the middle of the day, because that hot July sun will bake the moisture right back out before the seed ever has a chance. I want to tell you about the summer I nearly lost a whole patch to my own impatience. The kids were small. Earl was working every hour the motel would give him, and I remember being so tired and so short on time that I went out and planted a bed at noon instead of waiting for evening, just to get it done and off my list. By the next afternoon, that bed had crusted over hard as a sidewalk, and maybe half my seed never came up at all. I had to go back to the store for a second packet, and that second packet I planted right, at dusk, watered well, and it came up thick as a carpet within a week. So learn from my mistake and save yourself the second trip to the store. Plant in the evening, water it in, and lay down a thin blanket of straw over the row, about as thick as your hand, right after you plant. Once those seedlings poke through, pull that straw back to the sides and let it work as mulch between the rows. Now, here's something a lot of you don't know, and it's the piece that makes this whole system worth your time. This one planting feeds you twice. You harvest it as a green in late summer, and you harvest it as a root all through the winter. When your seedlings are 3 to 4 inches tall, you thin them out, pulling the weakest and the most crowded, leaving the strongest ones standing about 3 to 4 inches apart down the row. Don't you dare throw those thinnings in the compost. Rinse them off and eat them. They're tender and mild, and that's your very first supper off that bed, sometimes only 3 or 4 weeks after you planted. Once the plants get to be 8 or 10 inches tall, you can start cutting the outer leaves for greens, but take no more than a third of any one plant at a time, and always leave the center crown alone so it can keep producing. That crown will keep feeding you greens for weeks if you're gentle with it. Then, once the roots themselves get to be about 2 to 3 inches across at the top, right about the width of that little seed packet you started with, you can start pulling them. The smaller ones are sweet and tender for supper right away. The bigger ones are what you're going to store. And don't panic if a frost comes before every root has sized up. A light frost actually sweetens the flavor. It's only a hard freeze in the ground that you want to beat. The science behind all this isn't complicated, and I'm not going to pretend I'm some kind of chemist, because I'm not. I'm just a woman who's done this every summer of her adult life. But it holds up. The University of Minnesota's Extension Office, which is about as no-nonsense as gardening advice gets, still publishes the same numbers I just gave you: 1/4 to a 1/2 inch planting depth, rows 12 to 18 inches apart, harvest roots at 2 to 3 inches across. Those aren't old wives' numbers. Those are the same numbers a modern land-grant university teaches today, because the plant hasn't changed, and neither has the way it grows. Wash your greens well before you cook them too, twice in cold water, because sand likes to hide down in those ribs, and that's just good kitchen sense. Nothing fancy about it. Once you're through the growing season, holding this crop through winter is the piece most people never learn. And it's the piece that used to be common knowledge in every kitchen in this country before the refrigerator moved in and everyone forgot the box in the basement ever existed. When you pull your roots, do it on a dry day and twist the tops off about 1 inch above the crown instead of cutting them. Twisting seals the wound better than a knife does. Don't wash the roots you're planning to store. Just brush the loose dirt off with a gloved hand, because washing invites rot, and rot is the only thing that'll ruin this whole winter's worth of food. Check every root over, and if you find one with a soft spot or a crack, set it aside to eat first. Don't store it with the good ones. If an old housewife's tricks are worth your time, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give this a thumbs up. It tells me you'd like more of these, and I've got a whole lifetime of them to share with you. For storage, what you're after is somewhere close to freezing without actually freezing, and as humid as you can manage without water dripping on the roots. Old-timers called that a root cellar, and if you don't have one, don't worry, because I never had a proper root cellar either, most of my married life. What I used was a wooden crate lined with slightly damp sand, layering roots in so they weren't touching each other. Sand, root, and I kept that crate in the coolest corner of an unheated garage that never dropped below freezing. Check it once a month. If a root turns soft or starts smelling sour, pull it out before it takes the ones around it down with it. That's not folklore, that's just plain biology. Cool and humid slows a root down, so it keeps longer. And it's the same reason your grocery store keeps its produce section refrigerated, except your basement box does the same job for 6 months without ever touching your electric bill. And here's the part that I think ought to bother you a little, the way it's always bothered me. Somewhere between the end of the Second World War and the mid-1960s, 3 things happened all at once in this country. Refrigerators went from a rich family's luxury to something in every kitchen. The interstate highway system went in, and suddenly a truckload of vegetables grown clear across the country could sit on a grocery store shelf within a few days. And the modern supermarket produce aisle, the one you and I both walk through every week now, opened up coast to coast. In the span of 1 generation, the job of feeding a family through winter moved off the back of a woman with a July garden bed and onto the back of a delivery truck. Nobody had to ban the home garden for that to happen. They just never bothered reminding you it still worked, because a family that fills a root cellar in October doesn't need that produce aisle in January. And there's simply more profit in you needing it every single week, all winter long. I don't think anybody sat down and plotted that on purpose. I just think it worked out very well for somebody, and nobody's ever gone out of their way to unteach it. Let's put the actual numbers next to each other, because I think they speak for themselves better than I can. One packet of open-pollinated turnip seed costs about $2. A bunch of turnip greens at the grocery store, enough for one person for one meal, runs you $3 to $4 most winters. One well-planted packet, cared for the way I just showed you, will feed a family greens through the fall and roots straight through the winter, meal after meal after meal, for that same $2. There isn't a coupon in the world that beats that math, and there never will be, because the math was never really the point of the produce aisle. Convenience is what they sell you, and convenience is worth something, I'll grant that. But convenience and cheap are two very different things, and a lot of folks have gotten those confused over the last 60 years or so. Now, here's the last piece, the one hardly anybody teaches anymore, and it's the one that turns this from a nice fall crop into something you never have to buy again. In October, when you're pulling your roots for storage, set aside 3 or 4 of the best ones. Not the biggest, mind you, the healthiest and most true to shape. If you're in a cold climate, replant those in the spring with the crown right at the soil line. If your winters are mild, you can just leave them in the ground under a bit of mulch and let them ride it out. Come the second spring, those roots will send up a tall flower stalk, 3 or 4 feet high, with little yellow blossoms, and eventually long, thin seed pods. Once those pods dry brown right on the plant, cut the stalks, hang them upside down in a paper sack, and give them a good shake. That sack will fill up with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of the very same pale oval seeds you started with. That's next year's packet, and the year after that, and every year after that, for free. Purple Top White Glow breeds true because it's open pollinated, which is exactly why the hybrid varieties took over so many seed racks. A hybrid won't grow back true to itself, so you have to come back and buy that packet all over again next year. A saved seed is a sale nobody ever gets to make twice, and I've been saving mine for decades because of it. I've put this whole system, this one and dozens more from my years running a household on not much of anything, into a little book called Linda's Homekeeping Handbook. Links right there in the description below if you'd like the whole thing laid out in one place to keep in your kitchen drawer. So here's what I want you to do this weekend, plain and simple. Go to your farm and garden store and buy 1 packet of open-pollinated Purple Top White Glow turnip seed. That's your $2 spent. Find your first frost date and count back about 10 weeks to mark your planting window on the calendar. When that week comes, prepare a bed where an early crop already came out. Work in some finished compost and plant your seed a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch deep in rows 12 to 18 inches apart. In the evening, not the middle of the day. Water it in gently and lay down a little straw. Then 4 weeks later, get out there and thin those seedlings hard and eat every bit of what you pull. Cut your greens sparingly once the plants are 8 to 10 inches tall, and start pulling roots once they're 2 to 3 inches across. Store what you're not eating right away in a box of damp sand somewhere cool, and check it once a month all winter. And in October, before you eat every single root, set aside a few of your best for next year's seed, so you never have to buy that packet again. I've done every bit of this myself, year after year, and it never once cost me more than a couple of dollars and an evening's work in July. Tell me down in the comments where you're from and what your own garden looks like this time of year. Whether you've ever grown a fall turnip patch or something else your own people planted back in the day. A rutabaga, a fall spinach, a storage cabbage. I read every single one of those comments, and I love hearing what other families hold on to. And if you'd like the whole system written out step by step, along with dozens more like it from my years keeping a household running on almost nothing. That book I mentioned, Linda's Homekeeping Handbook, has it all. Links down in the description. Next time, I want to tell you about the one plant my own mother kept along the fence line that fed her whole flock of hens for free, and the exact year the feed companies made sure it quietly disappeared from every seed rack in the country. You won't believe how simple it was, or how long it's been gone. The women who kept this country's homes running knew things we're only just starting to remember.